Welcome to Chapter 2. We are going to address a very important issue in Chapter 2, and that is the issue of truth in morality. So we all know that lots of people have different beliefs about what's right and what's wrong, what's okay, what's not okay. And so we express these beliefs in language all the time to one another. We can tell other people what we believe, and we're going to call these beliefs moral beliefs. We'll also sometimes call them moral judgments. When we make a judgment, something is right or not right. We express these judgments, these beliefs, sometimes people call them morals, when we say things like abortion is wrong, or when we say something like a woman has a right to decide. We're expressing our judgment or a belief about a moral or ethical issue. And so in this chapter, we're going to wonder, can those beliefs or judgments, can they be true? And if so, in what sense can they be true? So we're going to take a look at three views in particular. The first view is called moral objectivism. The second view is called moral relativism. And there are two specific versions that we're going to consider in this chapter of relativism. The first is called cultural relativism, and the second is called subjective relativism. So those are the three views: moral objectivism, cultural relativism, and subjective relativism. In your textbook, there's a fourth position that's discussed, and it's called emotivism. We're going to set that view aside. The differences between it and subjective relativism are going to more or less be unimportant for our purposes. So we're going to take each view in turn here, see what they have to say, and we're just going to be thinking about which is the correct view of truth in morality. Moral objectivism is the theory that truth in morality is objective. What that means is that a moral statement, like a woman has a right to decide what happens to her body, can be true or false independently of what people think about that statement. All right, so we could draw an analogy here to like mathematical statements. Take a statement like 2 + 2 = 4. That's just objectively true, meaning that even if I don't believe that 2 + 2 = 4, that has no bearing, right? The fact that I don't believe it has no bearing on it being true, right? It's still true even if I don't believe it. Same thing could be said for the statement, Earth is spherical. Right? That statement is objectively true, and it doesn't matter if Tom is a flat earther and he doesn't believe that the Earth is spherical. He believes it's flat. Right? He just has a false belief. Right? His belief doesn't change reality. It doesn't change the fact that Earth is a sphere. So to say that morality is objective, to say that there is objective morality, just means that moral statements can be true or false in the same sense that mathematical statements can be true or false. 2 + 2 = 4, that's true. 2 + 2 = 5, that's false. All right, so when we're talking about moral objectivism, it's important to see that moral objectivism is not the same view as a view that we might call absolutism. So absolutism says that there are strict moral rules that can never be broken. Right? So maybe a rule like cheating is always wrong or stealing is always wrong. According to absolutism, it's never okay to break these rules. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. Right? So if that view is true, if absolutism is true, if stealing is always wrong, then moral objectivism is also true. Right? Like if it's true that stealing is always wrong, then of course moral truths are objective. Right? But absolutism need not be true in order for moral objectivism to be true. So there are some theories in ethics that we're going to study in this book that say that what's right or wrong can depend on the circumstances. All right, so here's an example to consider. Suppose that a parent has two children on the verge of starvation, and they're so deep in poverty that they can't afford to buy food for their kids. And so let's just imagine that the only way that they can feed their children is if they walk down to the local marketplace and steal a loaf of bread from the grocery store. All right, on the assumption that that's the only way that they can feed their children, otherwise the children will die of starvation, let's say, seems fairly plausible to suggest that if they steal the loaf of bread, what they're doing is not wrong, because if they don't steal the loaf of bread, the result is many times worse than if they just steal the bread. Right? It's worse to allow two innocent children to die than it is to steal a loaf of bread. So in this case, the person should steal the loaf of bread. Right? Now, we're not saying that it must be true that stealing is morally okay in this case. We're just saying that there are some moral theories that we're going to explore in this class that suggest stealing is okay in that case. They are certainly not absolutist moral theories, but they still can be totally objective in the sense that they are presupposing that there is objective morality, that certain things can be objectively right and other things can be objectively wrong. So absolutism kind of presupposes moral objectivism, but moral objectivism and absolutism, they're not the same view. Right? It's totally coherent to be a moral objectivist who says the right thing to do depends on the circumstances. All right, now what's really important to see when we're talking about whether morality depends on the circumstances is that even if morality depends on the circumstances, that doesn't mean it depends on what people think. Right? So if morality depends on what people think, that leads us to our next view, which is called moral relativism. So moral relativism says that there is no absolute moral truth. Right? So the relativist will say, if you think there's a good analogy to be drawn between mathematical truth and moral truth, right? If you think a statement like torturing toddlers for fun is wrong can be true in the same sense that 2 + 2 = 4 is true, you're totally mistaken. There is no objective moral truth, says the moral relativist. Rather, moral truth is relative to what people think. Natural next question to ask is relative to who? Right? Relative to who thinking what? All right. So there are two flavors of moral relativism. One is called subjective relativism. That says that moral truth is relative to individual people and what they think. And then there's cultural relativism, which says that moral truth is relative to cultures and what most people in a culture think. So we're going to take a look at each of these views in more detail. These are the main views that we're going to consider in this chapter. Let's first consider subjective relativism in some more detail. So according to this view, an action can only be right for a person. Right? So it could be like right for me, wrong for you. There is no objective moral truth according to this view. So if we were to consider a moral statement like torturing innocent toddlers for fun is wrong, according to subjective relativism, that statement can't be objectively true. It can't be like a fact of the matter regarding the truth of that statement. Its truth would just be relative to individual people. Right? So like if I think it's wrong to torture innocent children for fun, then that's just wrong for me. Right? It's true for me to say that it's wrong. But if somebody who's sadistic and enjoys inflicting pain on other people thinks that it's okay to do this, then it's okay for them. It would be true for them to say it's okay to torture innocent toddlers for fun. All right, so this view, subjective relativism, it's certainly not the view that everyone has their own moral beliefs. Right? That's not what the view is. Anyone who denies that obviously true claim that everyone has their own moral beliefs would just obviously be mistaken. Right? We know that people have disagreements with one another all the time. They have difference in opinion about what's okay and what's not okay. Everybody knows, every reasonable person, I should say, knows that everyone has their own moral beliefs. Subjective relativism says that in addition to that obvious fact, everyone has their own moral beliefs, guess what? Truth and morality is relative to what you think. Right? Nobody is really right or wrong when it comes to the morals that they have. Everyone just has different morals. Here's another example to consider. Suppose that a racist says it's okay to discriminate against non-whites. Maybe this racist even wants a society where whites are privileged and all non-whites are discriminated against. They think that that's like, the just or ideal society. All right, so that's a moral view, right? To think that it's okay to discriminate against non-whites. That's a certain kind of moral belief. And according to subjective relativism, this belief would be true for that person, even if it's not true for me. So even if I find the belief like repulsive, right, I think that it's false, according to subjective relativism, it's not like I'm in the right for thinking that that's a bad view. I just have my own view, this racist has their own view, and neither of us is like getting things right. Right? We just have our own separate views. Mine are true for me, the racists are true for the racist. The title of this slide is Why Subjective Relativism is Ridiculous. Now, I should stress that in philosophy, most professionals in the field are not subjective relativists. They don't endorse the view because they recognize that there are serious problems with this view. However, there are lots of people out there in the world who are subjective relativists, or at least think they are. They profess to be subjective relativists. In lots of my classes in the past, I've asked students, are you a moral objectivist or a relativist? And many of them will say, no, I'm a subjective relativist. And so it's important to show why this view is just kind of like incoherent. It doesn't make any sense because so many people believe it. I think the reason why so many people believe it is simply because they haven't really thought about what it implies. And so we're just going to take a look at what this view really implies. All right, first implication. Everyone is morally infallible if subjective relativism is true. What that means is that, suppose that Ted Bundy or Charles Manson or Jeffrey Dahmer were to state their moral beliefs, like what they think is okay to do. And suppose they say, well, yeah, it's okay to just murder innocent people. According to subjective relativism, having that view, right, and living the kinds of lives that they lived would be no better or worse than living the kind of life that, say, like Martin Luther King lived, right, where the idea, according to Dr. King's view, was that people should be treated equally. Right? So, according to subjective relativism, the moral view held by Dr. Martin Luther King, when compared to the moral view held by Jeffrey Dahmer, is just like sort of on a par with one another. There's no sense in which one could be better or worse than the other. All right, so that seems really weird, right? To say that the belief that it's okay to murder innocent people is sort of like just as true as the belief that everyone should be treated equally. All right, another implication of subjective relativism, moral judgments end up uh, being just a matter of preference or a matter of taste, right? So by analogy here, think about your ice cream preferences. Maybe you like vanilla. You think that's the best flavor of ice cream. Or maybe you like strawberry or chocolate. You think strawberry is the best flavor, chocolate's the best flavor. Now, suppose you think that vanilla is the best flavor, and suppose I think that chocolate is the best flavor. These are matters of taste that we're talking about when we talk about ice cream preferences. And we totally recognize that in the case of our ice cream preferences, it's not like I am getting things right if I like chocolate the best, and you are getting things wrong if you like vanilla the best. Right? Like in the case of ice cream preferences, beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. Right? It's not like anybody's getting anything right and other people are getting things wrong if they don't share the same favorite flavor. Right? We know that's true of ice cream preferences. Now, subjective relativism says when it comes to our moral beliefs, our beliefs about what's right and what's wrong, those beliefs are just like ice cream preferences. My beliefs aren't any more true or false than yours when it comes to beliefs about right and wrong. And this seems clearly ridiculous. Right? Like if I say a woman has a right to decide what happens to her body, and then somebody else says, no, she doesn't, that kind of disagreement certainly doesn't feel to me like the disagreement two people have when one person says chocolate is the best ice cream and the other person says no, it's vanilla. For one, the ice cream preference people certainly aren't going to have any kind of argument with one another. They're not going to try and cite reasons for thinking chocolate's better than vanilla or vice versa. Moreover, they're not going to think that the other person is wrong. They're not going to think the other person is making a mistake, provided that these are reasonable adults that we're talking about. Now, when it comes to debates over something like abortion, for instance, if one person says a woman has a right to decide, another person says no, she doesn't, that feels like a genuine debate where people can offer reasons for thinking a woman has a right to decide or she doesn't. Right? Feels like the sort of thing that makes sense to have kind of reasonable public disagreement about. And it seems totally okay and it makes sense for me to say, no, this other person who denies a woman's right to decide is just making a mistake. Right? And presumably, it's also okay for this other person to think that of my view. Right? If they think that a woman doesn't have a right to decide, then they should think of my view that it's false. Right? That's quite unlike ice cream preferences. Right? If I think vanilla is the best, that doesn't make sense for me to think that you are making a mistake if you think chocolate is better. All right, so the third implication here of subjective relativism, moral beliefs are meaningless. Now, why do we say this? Well, take the phrase true for me. Right? The subjective relativist uses this phrase to kind of cash out what it means to say that there's truth in morality. Right? They say there can only be like true for me, true for you, but there's no sense in which there's absolute truth in morality, according to this view. Right? But what does this mean, true for me? Right? It sounds like all it means is like that's what I believe. If I say something's true for me, I'm saying that's what I believe. But remember, this view doesn't just say that we have different beliefs. Right? It says something stronger than that. It says there can be no objective truth in morality because there can only be like true for me or true for you. Right? So what this view ends up suggesting is that if I think torture is wrong, for instance, that doesn't really mean that torture is wrong, right? Because if it really meant that, then it would be the sort of thing that could be absolutely true or false. Right? So my belief can only be true for me, and if true for me just means that's what I believe, then it looks like my belief just ends up referring back to itself. Right? If I say torture is wrong, for me, all that means is that I believe torture is wrong. It doesn't really mean that torture is wrong. Right? So then we might wonder, well, what's the point of having any moral beliefs then? Right? Like, why believe that torture is wrong if it's not really wrong? Right? If the statement torture is wrong isn't true in the absolute sense, why believe it? Right? So anyone who understands what subjective relativism says would presumably end up just rescinding or giving up all of their moral beliefs. Right? They wouldn't think that anything is right or wrong or okay because they would recognize, uh, it just doesn't make any sense to continue to have a belief about things being right or wrong if there really is no fact of the matter. Right? Just as in the case of our ice cream preferences, we do not take ourselves seriously when we say things like chocolate's the best flavor. We don't take ourselves to be making some true claim about the world. We're expressing some absolute truth when we say chocolate's the best. No, we're just reporting on our preferences. If morality is like that too, then it looks like having moral beliefs would be a meaningless and kind of pointless waste of one's cognitive resources. All right, final point to make here about subjective relativism. Suppose that there is no absolute truth. Right? Does it even make sense to say that? I don't think so, but let's just suppose that there is no absolute truth. Then what does that mean for subjective relativism? Well, it means that it itself is not true in an absolute sense. Right? At best, it could be relatively true. Right? So maybe subjective relativism could be true for subjective relativists, but it certainly can't be true for everyone. Right? Not everyone believes it, in which case the view itself isn't true in an absolute sense. Right? Can't be, by the very nature of what the view is, can't be true in an absolute sense. Right? So if it's not true in an absolute sense, why accept it? Right? Why believe it? Right? So all of these implications seem to show just how ridiculous subjective relativism really is. So what we just said about subjective relativism, maybe that comes as a surprise to some of you, maybe it comes as no surprise to others of you. Um, just because I think something is true, that doesn't make it true. Right? And the subjective relativist says exactly the opposite. If I think something is true in the case of morality, then it is true for me. All right. So what about this other view, cultural relativism? Cultural relativism indexes moral truth not to individual people, but rather to cultures. So according to cultural relativism, the rightness of an action is relative to an entire culture rather than a specific individual person. All right, so we're going to take a look at some implications of cultural relativism. We'll look at some examples to kind of spell out what this view is and see if it can do any better than subjective relativism. One ethical issue that we can think about in connection with this idea of cultural relativism is a cultural practice that's called female genital mutilation. And it's a practice that's common in many different parts of the world, something to the tune of like 300 million living women have undergone this practice. And what it involves is basically taking a sharp knife, like a razor blade, to the genitals of a prepubescent girl around the ages of 8, 9, or 10, sometimes even younger, 6 or 7, and cutting. Different ways to perform the procedure. Sometimes it involves cutting the clitoris, cutting the labias. There are YouTube videos available with women who serve as activists nowadays. They speak out against this practice. Many of them have undergone the procedure themselves. But it's common in the cultures that practice it because it's viewed by many in the cultures that practice it to be a way of cleansing young girls. The idea is that it reduces or eliminates the possibility of sexual pleasure. And so women, when they're less likely to experience sexual pleasure, they're going to be more likely to be loyal to their husbands. They're going to be more likely to remain interested in doing household work rather than being out and about, looking for other potential mates or things like that. So it's viewed in the cultures that practice it to be a way of purifying women, cleansing them, keeping them loyal, and that's the idea. So these are like cultural reasons that people offer to support the practice. Any outsider can see that this seems to be a way of just oppressing women. It's a way of controlling women's bodies, controlling their sexuality. And the way this issue would relate to cultural relativism is that according to the cultural relativist point of view, there is no fact of the matter outside of a kind of cultural preference concerning whether female genital mutilation is okay. Right? So according to cultural relativism, the practice is morally permissible in the cultures that practice it, and it's morally impermissible in cultures that tend not to practice it because most people in the culture think that it's wrong. Right? So whereas female genital mutilation would be okay in a culture where most people think it's okay and where it's commonly practiced, female genital mutilation is not okay in, say, U.S. culture, right, where it's not commonly practiced. Most people find the very idea very repulsive. Obviously wrong from our point of view because it violates young girls' bodily autonomy, takes away their freedom of choice concerning what happens to their bodies, what sort of surgeries they undergo, or what kinds of cosmetic adjustments we make to their bodies. It puts them through a tremendous amount of pain too. I mean, this practice is typically done without any anesthesia whatsoever. Right? So you feel all the pain when you're a young girl who is mutilated in this way. All right, so we can use that example to think about cultural relativism. It helps to put into perspective what this view actually says about a kind of real world issue. All right, so let's talk about why anyone would think that cultural relativism is true. The most popular argument in favor of cultural relativism is this argument here on this slide. So the basic idea behind the argument is that people around the world have different views about what's right and what's wrong. We know that. That's just a basic fact of the world. People have different views about what's okay and what's not okay. The crucial idea underlying this argument here is the second assumption. Right, the second assumption here says if people's ideas about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then morality itself must be relative to culture. There are no objective moral principles. So the conclusion here is, since people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, it must be true that right and wrong are themselves relative to culture, and so there are no objective moral principles. That's the idea behind this argument. So we're starting from premises that cite differences in belief, differences in judgment around the world, and then we're arriving at a conclusion about rightness and wrongness themselves. The idea is that the rightness or wrongness of an action itself is determined by what most people in the culture think. But is this argument any good? Right? Is this a logically convincing argument for cultural relativism? Well, doesn't seem like it is. Right? From the mere fact that people in different cultures make different moral judgments, doesn't follow that those cultures are going to have different moral standards, or there's going to be a different fact of the matter in different cultures regarding what's right and what's wrong. Like, why should what most people in a culture think determine what's right in that culture? Think about, like, in the 1800s in the American South, when slavery was widely accepted, What reason is there to think that just because most people, the majority of people living in the American South in the 19th century, thought it was okay to own slaves, why think that that made it okay? Just because most people thought it was okay. For another example, why think that just because, most people in Nazi culture thought that exterminating Jews and other minorities was okay, why think that that made it okay in Nazi culture? Right? Just because one person thinks something is true, it doesn't make it true. So why think that just because a group of people think that something is true, that it's thereby true? All right, so that's one problem for this argument. Another problem for the argument is that it seems to rest on a mistaken logical principle, namely the principle that if people disagree about what's true, therefore there can be no fact of the matter concerning whether that thing is actually true. Right? The idea behind the argument that we just saw in the last slide is that since people disagree about right and wrong, therefore there's no objective fact of the matter regarding what's right and what's wrong, and right and wrong are just relative to cultural preference. All right, now consider by analogy though, you say Earth is round or spherical. A flat earther jumps into the conversation and says, no, Earth is flat. Right? So there's a disagreement there. One person says Earth is a sphere, another person says, no, it's flat. We have a disagreement. Right? Earth can't be both a sphere and not a sphere at the same time. It's got to be one or the other. Right? So seems like a mistake, a logical mistake for somebody to say, oh, because two people disagree about the shape of the Earth, there must be no objective truth about the shape of the Earth. There must be no fact of the matter. Right? So Earth is a sphere for me, but it's flat for that other person. Right? If all we mean by that is that I believe it's a sphere and they believe it's flat, that's fine. But here we're not talking about what people believe. Right? We're trying to talk about like the way the world is. We're trying to talk about reality. Right? So we can't draw a conclusion about reality solely on the basis of psychological facts about people. Right? There's a disagreement between two people. That doesn't entitle us to say, well, reality must not have any objective shape to it, right? Like Earth, a portion of reality must not have any objective shape to it. All right, so that's the logical mistake. We can't draw conclusions about what reality is like solely on the basis of knowing that there's some disagreement between some people about what reality is like. So too when it comes to morality. Just because people disagree about what's morally right and wrong doesn't mean that there's no objective fact of the matter. Right? Disagreement is one thing, reality is another. Okay, so much for Stace's argument for cultural relativism. It rests on an invalid logical principle. There are further reasons to think that cultural relativism is not the view to endorse. It seems to result in the same kind of absurdities that subjective relativism results in. So one implication of cultural relativism is that cultures are morally infallible. Right? In the case of subjective relativism, remember that view implied that individual people are morally infallible. What that means is you can't make a mistake in moral thinking if subjective relativism is true. If you think something's wrong, then it is wrong for you. Right? So it's impossible to have a false moral belief. According to subjective relativism, it's impossible to learn anything about right and wrong if subjective relativism is true, because there's nothing to be learned. Right? Your view can never be mistaken. So the same kind of implication arises for cultural relativism, only this time it's cultures that are morally infallible. Right? So think about like, Nazi culture would be morally infallible according to cultural relativism. It's not like Nazis were doing anything wrong according to cultural relativism. They were just doing something that was right according to Nazi culture, maybe wrong according to a different culture, but there's no basis for privileging one set of cultural moral standards over another, according to this view. That seems ridiculous, right? A society or a culture that prioritizes freedom and moral equality, that that says it doesn't matter what skin color you have or what your ethnicity or race is or what gender you are. Those things don't matter to how you are to be treated by other people. Seems like a better society or a culture when the society endorses those values rather than says, well, let's just exterminate minorities in gas chambers. All right, so this idea that cultures are just morally infallible seems ridiculous. Now, notice we're not saying that our culture is going to be superior to every other culture in every regard. Certainly, our culture is going to be, able to progress, able to do things better in the future than we currently do. Right? So we're not saying that if cultural relativism is false, that we therefore must always be in the right regarding what we do. We're saying quite the opposite. Right? If cultural relativism is false, then of course it makes sense to criticize our own culture too. Right? Whereas if cultural relativism is true, then criticizing our own culture doesn't really make any sense. All right, so criticizing our own culture for being not as inclusive as it could be, right? Or if you think that systemic racism, for instance, is real and causes real disadvantage to people, and that's like a bad thing, and we could do better. If you think that, then you can't be a cultural relativist, right? Because according to cultural relativism, there can only be cultural change. There's never any progress. The society can't become better than it currently is. It also can't become worse because, according to this view, there are no objective standards that would determine what counts as progress. Right, so moral progress is impossible on this view. Suppose we have somebody who wants to reform society, and we can imagine like a civil rights activist. Take Dr. King again. Dr. King, in fighting for racial equality, would have been making a mistake according to cultural relativism. Right? That view would imply that he was speaking falsely because he was speaking against the majority-held opinion in the American South, which was that Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, were totally legitimate. Right? So in arguing against the majority opinion, Dr. King would be arguing against the truth in the culture if what most people think determines the moral truth. According to cultural relativism, it does. Right? So that seems to be another absurdity of this view. Right? It's like, no, Dr. King was speaking the truth in arguing against Jim Crow laws. Those were highly unjust laws. They damaged lives for decades. Some more things to say about the absurdity of cultural relativism. The main argument that we saw for this view was Stace's argument, which rested the entire case for cultural relativism on the idea that people disagree about right and wrong. But if disagreement about something implies that there's no objective fact of the matter regarding that thing, right? So if disagreement about morality implies no fact of the matter objectively about what's right and what's wrong, then of course cultural relativism can't be true. Right? Because not everyone accepts cultural relativism. I, for one, don't accept it, given the absurdities that it results in and the lack of support for it. So if there's disagreement about cultural relativism, and if the logical principle, disagreement implies no fact of the matter, is true, then of course cultural relativism can itself be true. Right? So that's a huge problem for the view. It seems to suggest that the view is internally inconsistent. It's incoherent, self-contradictory, we might say. All right, and then the last absurdity of cultural relativism is that it implies that anything could be morally okay. You just need most people in a culture to think that that thing is okay. Right? Now, that seems like a mistake because it seems obvious that something like, torturing toddlers for fun is wrong. Right? Why think that that would be okay? Of course, some weirdo, some psychopath might think it's okay, but so what? Right? It's like, why should they get to decide what's right and what's wrong? Right? So we could say similar things about the flat earther. Like, just because somebody thinks the earth is flat, it's not like they get to decide the shape of the earth. It's not something that we humans get to decide. Right? So we could say the same thing about morality. Like, why think that any human gets to decide what's right and what's wrong? Um, Perhaps one final problem for this view, like, if you thought that the fact that people have different views about right and wrong implied that there's no objective fact of the matter regarding right and wrong, why would you conclude that right and wrong are determined by what most people think rather than what the individual person thinks? Right? So, like, if the argument for cultural relativism were any good, it would seem to imply the truth of subjective relativism rather than cultural relativism, because after all, there are differences of opinion within cultures across different individual people in one and the same culture. Okay, so the last issue we are going to think about in this chapter is the relation between cultural relativism and tolerance. In general, it seems like a good thing to be tolerant of different ways of living and behaving. So for instance, I might come from a culture where it's normal to wear clothes on one's body, whereas somebody else might come from a culture where it's not normal to wear clothes and pretty much everyone walks around nude or partially nude. And, who am I to say that a culture where people are clothed is better than a culture where they aren't? And when it comes to that sort of issue, it looks like what we're dealing with is just like a social norm, what we called a social norm in chapter 1. Right? There's like a socially acceptable way of appearing in front of people, but of course that can vary across cultures. Right? So it's good not to judge a culture negatively when the thing that you're judging doesn't necessarily warrant the judgment. When it doesn't make good sense, doesn't make reasonable sense to pass on a negative judgment to a specific culture. Now, how people dress, that's one thing, but it's not like everything somebody could do in a culture would thereby be something that we should be tolerant of. Right? Was the right response to discovering that Jews are being exterminated in concentration camps during World War II, is the right response to say, oh, we should just be tolerant of people being treated in that way? Well, no, that seems ridiculous. That's something that we should not tolerate, right? Not everything is something that should be tolerated. If it's a serious moral wrong, then we should do something about it. Right? We shouldn't tolerate it. So, it's certainly true that tolerance is an admirable virtue. It's good to be tolerant, but that doesn't mean that we should tolerate everything. All right, now here's the point. A lot of people are tempted to be cultural relativists because they think that that is the only kind of culturally sensitive point of view about morality. Right? If we say that all cultures are morally equal in their moral values, that seems to suggest that we should just be tolerant of people from other cultures and their behaviors. Now, the fact of the matter is, cultural relativism doesn't entail that we should be tolerant towards others. There are some cultures where most people think the right way to behave with someone who doesn't share your view isn't to tolerate you, but rather to treat you terribly or maybe even kill you, right, if you disagree with them, if you don't share their moral or religious view. And according to cultural relativism, if somebody were to kill somebody else because they didn't share their view, it's not like that would be objectively wrong, because there are no objective wrongs, according to cultural relativism. So what relativism would say is basically, if you're in a culture that values tolerance, that says you should typically be tolerant of other people, then of course it's good to be tolerant in those cultures. But being tolerant is not good in every culture. Right? So that's what we should say about the relation between cultural relativism and tolerance. It certainly doesn't entail that tolerance is an objectively good thing. Another reason why some people are sometimes tempted to think relativism is true is they think that it implies that we shouldn't judge other people. If all moral views across all cultures are just equal, then doesn't that mean that we shouldn't judge other people's views? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily entail that. If it's true, if it's objectively true that we should not judge people from other cultures, then that would be an objective moral truth. Of course, in some cultures, it is okay to judge people from other cultures. Right? So if we say we shouldn't judge people from other cultures and we're relativists, then we recognize that that's just kind of one belief that someone could have, but it's not necessarily true. It's not absolutely true across the board or universally true. Right? Now, if you think that it is objectively good to be tolerant of other people, or it is objectively good not to make hasty or ill-informed or unreasonable judgments about other people, then you're going to think that cultural relativism is false. Right? Because if tolerance is an objective moral value, or if there are reasonable limitations on the kinds of judgments that we should make about other people, and there just like objectively are such limitations on our judgments, then moral objectivism would be true, not cultural relativism. Right, so what we're going to do in some of the later chapters is explore different versions of moral objectivism. So just because one person is an objectivist, it doesn't mean that they endorse any particular theory of right and wrong. They just say that there are objective facts about right and wrong. So there's a bunch of different theories out there, ethical theories that we're going to take a look at that are objectivist theories that say there are objective truths about morality waiting to be discovered, and we just need to apply our ability to reason in order to discover them.